Hello, everyone. This is W, host of the High Art on the Edge page, host of 2 podcast features. That is correct. The first one is PCE, which stands for Post-Concert Energy. The second podcast feature is known as Surprise Cast, and that is the one you're listening today. Speaking of today, yes, we have a very special guest here. A guest that you may be familiar with. British music journalist and broadcaster who has chiseled out a really nice career for himself. In today's conversation, we're going to get to know this person a little bit more, not just about his work, not just about journalism, but everything under the sun. So sit back, grab yourself a good drink, and enjoy my conversation with this mysterious guest. Let us bring him in. Who are you?
I'm Pete Paphides, and well, there's probably not much more to add other than what you've just said. But yeah, my name is Pete, and maybe anything else relevant about me will be revealed over the course of the next hour or so, maybe.
Thank you for being here, Pete. Much appreciated. I'm going to start off with a little tale written by Ethan Hawke. It is from a book called Rules for a Night. And this is kind of a little story that was written by him to share with his children. Here it goes. One time, on a sweltering August night, Grandfather and I made camp down by the ocean. He said, "While I teach you about the ways of war, I want you to know that the real struggle is between the 2 wolves that live inside each of us." 2 wolves? I asked, seated on an old log near the fire. My eyes were transfixed by the flames twisting uncomfortably in the night air. Yes, 1 wolf is evil. It is anger. It is envy. It is greed, pity, deceit, false pride. He paused, poking the embers of our fire with the long stick he'd been carving. The other is good. It is joy, love, hope, humility, loving, forgiveness, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, faith. I considered that for a minute, then tentatively asked, which wolf will win? Spark danced toward the stars as the old man stared into the glare of the flames and replied, whichever one you feed. So, here's my first question for you, Pete.
Yeah.
What kind of wolf was manifesting itself during your childhood? Were you the wolf of love and hope and compassion? Or were you more of the wolf of greed, envy?
What's the word for a baby wolf? What do we call their offspring?
I don't know.
I was a confused one of those. I think, I guess to answer your question, I think we're all born. The wolf of love is what we are when we're born.
Mhm.
And then things happen to other wolves along the way, and they, for whatever reason, they seek to they s- they either for power, for or for other kinds of acquisitiveness. They they feel that their purpose here, because everything is a competition, of course, is to create division in order to set all the other wolves against each other. And so we're all definitely when we're born, we have to learn how to hate, but we know how to love from the outset. That's what I believe.
So you grew up with Greek parents, is that correct?
Yeah.
So with that experience, in terms of the wolf here,
Yeah.
what did you acquire from your parents that really showed that good side of the wolf, the
Well,
humility, the kindness?
they loved me. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the binary implied here by the story is sort of completely works in all instances.
Sure.
But certainly in my childhood, I was loved. I was unconditionally loved, and my parents, made all sorts of sacrifices to ensure that me and my brother got a good start in life. Sometimes I resented those sacrifices. I sometimes I felt they should be more selfish, actually, because I thought it created dysfunction between them. It created tension between them that wasn't actually benefiting them or anyone else in other ways. But I never doubted their motives. Their motives were always from a place of love. If I ever had any sort of complaint as I was growing up, it was almost I was loved too much in too kind of constricting a way. But yeah, no, my parents wanted to leave the world a better place than how they found it. Yeah, I'd say that.
People that are listening to this podcast may be thinking, love too much. How is that a bad thing?
Well, it's not a bad thing, but it's not, as of itself, it's not intrinsically a bad thing. But I think, there are all sorts of ways you can love too much. You can cosset someone, you can kind of inadvertently stifle them, you can kind of swathe them in metaphorical cotton wool and leave them unprepared for the challenges that adulthood lies ahead. I'm sure we all know people like that. We've all seen instances where that has happened. And so that's the kind of loving too much, I would say. You could definitely characterize it as such. Yeah.
What did your dad do for a living?
Well, both my parents ran a fish and chip shop in the West Midlands. They ran three with fish and chip shops, but none of them at the same time. So they would sell one and then move on to another. And my mother, on top of that, was obviously living in the society and in the kind of world that she lived in and in the kind of marriage she was in. She was obviously in charge of a lot of the housework and all the stuff that has traditionally been seen as kind of motherly, if you like. So but yeah, they had a fish and chip shop, so like for everything, that was our world sort of revolved around that in a way, and around the kind of long opening hours and the early starts and all the stuff that you had to do with that. And we were kind of expected, my brother and I, there was a sort of expectation that we would, maybe take it over, maybe keep the business going when they no longer could. But neither of us were interested in doing that.
With being raised by Greek parents, did they bring that Grecian flavor to your life?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what it's a classic sort of thing that happens with immigrants, that they try and create a little version of the country that they came from in the world that they moved to. And that's actually that actually culturally sort of enriches all of us. And one of the things I love about Great Britain and London especially is that despite what President Trump has tried to sort of have Americans believe, then it's I live in a very tolerant place. There's a kind of high street near where I live, which is literally like in a 100-meter stretch. You can have like Somalian cafes coexisting with West Indian barber shops, with Greek groceries, with Turkish and Kurdish food shops, and it goes on and on and on. East Asian like sushi places, East Asian groceries, and nothing happened. Nothing. The crime rate is pretty low. It's and there's just a lovely atmosphere about being in those sorts of places. There's a sort of it's without even realizing it, it kind of liberalizes everyone. It kind of fosters a kind of live and let live kind of vibe. And actually, it's way more liberal than where I grew up, which was a part of Birmingham where I grew up. Certainly when I was a teenager in the 1980s, you couldn't. It was fairly diverse, but but you couldn't. The streets were quiet after 6 o'clock, and then if I got off the bus coming back from town to one of the kind of indie music nights I'd sometimes go to, I'd have to run all the way home, because if people were coming out of the pubs I guess it would have been your equivalent of jocks who would like see someone who looked like me and they would give chase. I was actually a really good runner because of that. I don't look like one now, but I had a real turn of speed. I'd often get chased all the way home.
I've heard this several times from artists where they have talked about this notion of hooliganism, particularly after football games. And
Yeah.
a lot of, if we want to for use lack of a better term, a lot of bullies constantly picking on people and chasing after them.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually beaten up once. When I was about 17, I met some friends in Birmingham city centre, and I didn't look outlandish, but I was clearly someone who, you'd be surprised if you came back to my house and didn't find a single Smiths record there, or a Jesus and Mary Chain record there, and a couple of soldiers who were on leave. I didn't know they were soldiers at the time. They were just dressed in their normal clothes. But I was outside a record store just hanging out with a couple of friends. We were waiting for one more friend to turn up. And I don't know if they're called squaddies in the States, but over here sometimes they're called squaddies, and it just means that they were soldiers on leave. And they just took exception to me and a friend of mine, and they just completely launched into us. They were just pummeling us, and I fell to the ground. And I was at the record shop I was standing outside. It was a very large one. It was the Virgin Mega store. And I remember I had to crawl into the record shop as I was being beaten up. They had security guards on the threshold of the record shop. And I just thought, if I could get a shot into the record store, then the security would have to get involved and like save my life, which I just about managed to do. And then I had all sorts of bruises and bumps. I went to the doctor. I didn't know that seeing stars, like you literally do see stars when you've been beaten up. I could just see all these stars dancing. I thought, oh, that's a real thing. It doesn't just happen in cartoons. And it was a thing. Like London, nothing like that has ever happened to me in London. It feels way safer. And my mum would never believe that. Like when I moved to London, my mum, who's a very protective Greek sort of matriarch, she thought that within, a fortnight of living here, someone would just find me in a ditch with a needle sticking out of my arm or something, especially as I was going to be a music journalist. And music journalist, she saw. But
with the relationship that you had with your mom and dad, tell me a trait that you're super proud of. That I know there are many, but tell me a trait that you're very proud of acquiring from mom and dad.
Well, weirdly enough, I mean, sometimes you accidentally acquire traits from your parents. The traits that they want to pass to you, they don't always pass on to you. And sometimes you pick things up by virtue of their sort of absence. And I sort of remember that there were ways in which her relationship to my dad was sort of stifling her, and sort of thinking that he wasn't emotionally very forthcoming, and that I just sort of remember thinking there's a sort of different kind of husband you can be.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd really like to be that sort of husband. I'd like to be like, if I ever get married, I don't want my wife to have secret resentments towards me. And I want to try and be empathetic. And so in a way, my kind of template of parenting as a father was one that I got from my mother. And so I'm very grateful to her for that. And also because when you have two parents that argue a lot, as mine did, and it's no secret, I've written about it in my book. When you have two parents that argue with each other, then sometimes you feel that often I felt like my dad was. I mean, I understand why he was unreasonable at times. He was under a lot of pressure. He was homesick. He was doing a job that he never envisaged he would do, and all these kind of mentally took a lot out of him. But often my mother would sort of bear the brunt of that. And so I would have to dance sort of I'd have to kind of dance a fairly delicate dance between them. So even if I was really kind of pissed off with him, I couldn't always show it. I had to because if he thought I was mad at him, then he'd kind of be more angry with my mother. So I'd often have to. So it really taught me a lot about diplomacy and politics, and hopefully, I hope it taught about emotional intelligence. And so I've taken lots of positives from my upbringing that weren't necessarily meant as positives. I've also, my dad was a huge love of music, and I remember I've got very early memories of the way music used to affect him very emotionally. And the kind of music he used to listen to was very melancholy Greek music, music that he'd grown up with. And it really amplified the sense of kind of homesickness that it was both a comfort and an amplification of his homesickness. But it really kind of brought a real atmosphere, like a heavy atmosphere into our house, which sometimes was quite stifling. But I've got to say, I remember every single one of those songs, and I really sort of think it's helped set the tone for a lot of the music that I like. And I loved seeing him sort of passionate about something. I loved that things could move. Later on, he became a massive ABBA fan. Like the only real English language group he liked were ABBA, and ABBA are quite possibly my favorite group of all time. Certainly, at least half the time they are. And we really bonded over that. And ABBA were one of the first groups that really acted as a sort of prism through which I understood the world. And there's a lot in ABBA songs to help you understand the world. They were almost like I had my real parents, but I also had my pop parents, and my pop parents were ABBA, and they were kind of roughly the same age as they're a little bit younger, but pretty much of the same generation as my parents. And so, if I heard a song like "Knowing Me, Knowing You," which is a song, it's kind of a real middle-aged kind of sometimes there are no happy endings kind of song. It's a song that sometimes it doesn't end up okay. These were songs that, these were some of the first, so, and there's loads, like Money, Money, Money by ABBA was like one of the first songs of theirs my dad really liked. And I totally see why now, because Money, Money, Money really is, it's if I were a rich man. It's no different. It's a song about how, like, when you're away, it's a song about how you can't have what you want, but money is like the way. If you save up money, it might get you what you've been missing all these years. It might be your reward one day for the things that you can't have now. So, and that I can see now why that was the song that turned him into an ABBA fan. I hope that answered your question.
Well, it does, and it did. Thank you so much. And I want to read another passage to you from this book, Rules for a Night, and how it applies to your life back then or now.
Sure.
Go for it. So this is a section where he's talking about friendship. The quality of your life, to a large extent, be decided by with whom you elect to spend your time. Yeah? So talk to me about friendships along the way that have possibly helped you in your career and changing your perspective on life.
My best friend when I was a kid, for the main part, was it. I wrote a book about my childhood and music, the part that music had to play in it, and I called him William in that. It wasn't his real name, but let's stick with William. And we were very different. We were kind of thrown together because our older brothers were best friends with each other, and we were temperamentally very different. But you kind of you just go with it in a way as a kid. You learn about each other's differences. He was obsessed with electronic music, especially Gary Newman. But Gary Newman really was his absolute lodestone, and he was quite he was also a huge Doctor Who fan, and he really seemed to take comfort by, in science fiction. He loved science fiction, and he loved the worlds that were opened up by electronic music, and I really learnt a lot about just a different way of being through him. He was the first person time I ever heard the word atheist was when he used it. He told me what an atheist was. It seemed shocking to me that he should have decided at the age of 9 or 10 that he didn't believe in God. I thought that was a really risky thing to say because you might get punished. I wanted to keep my options open. So it was very maverick of him, I thought, to just be so certain, to have such certainty about the non-existence of God, and we stayed really good. Well, I kind of he was a real inspiration to me because he had a much better sense of humor than me, and so when I started trying to write funny things, I was really trying to copy him. He had a very sort of Monty Python-esque sense of humor, and I was really trying to imitate him and get it wrong. And I think often, when you kind of finally achieve sort of some success in the field that you hope that you might get some success in, be it music or acting or writing or whatever, I think a lot of the people I'm sure you've spoken to sort of had a friend that was like really naturally more gifted at it than them, or that they kind of copped a lot of their ideas from. And you always feel a bit of guilt if you manage to kind of get some success in your chosen field, and they might go on to do other things, they might lose interest or whatever, but you sort of almost feel that you kind of perhaps kind of stole something from them that was kind of rightfully theirs, that you use them as a sort of leg up. But I don't think I'd be doing what I'd be doing if it wasn't for him. And also there was a girl that lived next door to us called Jed, which was short for Geraldine, and she was 4 years older than me, and she was extraordinarily patient with me. I used to sort of ask her all sorts of questions about things I didn't know. She was about growing up and about music. She was a huge Paul Simon fan, and she loved Joe Jackson, and she loved the Beatles. First time I ever heard the Beatles was when she played me the Beatles.
Oh,
and to be like 14 or 15 and to be kind of have endless amounts of tolerance for the kind of annoying 10 or 11-year-old boy who lives next door to you, that shows a really special soul, a real generosity. And we're still friends, by the way, which I'm just as proud of. And I remember her playing me I Am the Walrus on the day after John Lennon died. Because she said to me, she mentioned something about the Beatles. She said something like, "Oh, it's amazing that he was in, sometimes it just kind of amazes you that he and Paul McCartney were in the same band." And I was like, "What do you mean, him and Paul McCartney? Paul McCartney from Wings?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Hang on, have I got this right? John Lennon." Who I knew for just like starting over, which I loved. He was in a band with Paul McCartney, and she said, "Yeah." She said, "Oh, do you want to hear them?" And she put on "I Am the Walrus," and it blew my mind because apart from anything else, it suddenly solved the riddle of ELO to me, because you can sort of see that song is kind of the egg from which ELO hatched as well. So that along the way, that solved that mystery as well. And I just thought, in that moment, like I forgot what direction time goes in, and I just thought, God, they were a super group, which I guess they were. If time goes backward, I guess they were a super group. Yeah, and I'll choose one friend from adulthood as well. I'm very lucky to be friends with Bob Stanley from Saint Etienne, and we had a lot of shared history that we didn't realize we had until we met each other for the first time. And he's just been so endlessly generous with his just encyclopedic music knowledge. His enthusiasm has been like very inspiring to me. He has sort of taught me that just you can be that thing that you were if like the thing you love most in the world, when you were 10 was records, then it's still okay to love that thing. There's a kind of pure, you're not doing anyone any harm. And God, compared to all the other hobbies you could have, that's pretty harmless one. And I love that. And actually, that's really informed my music writing. Just enthused, just actually just forget about stuff you don't like. Just like focus on stuff that you like, and just be an evangelist. So that's Bob's a huge reason why I try and be that way.
which I think transitions beautifully out of the Night Book and into a book called The Listening Party, written by Tim Burgess.
Mm.
And you had written a nice little piece here, and I want to read something to you and
Mm.
ask about it. And this is what you said. When I was in my teens studying for a philosophy A level, we were taught about epiphenomenalism, the idea that the soul is an epiphany phenomenon, a
Yeah,
metaphysical byproduct of the human body. No amount of knowledge of the workings of the human body can get you closer to understanding the nature of the soul. And even though the soul can't exist without the body, no corporeal investigation, no matter how thorough, can demystify it. And that's how it is with our favorite records. And then you go on
yeah.
talking about the listening parties and Paul McCartney, blah, 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 blah. So I love this. And I told you I've read bits and pieces of this passage to other artists. So
Oh,
talk to
well,
us about music, the communal experience, and how it relates to either these listening parties or whilst you were growing up.
it's it's I mean, it's if I was holding up a record in my hand now, you just cannot reduce this artifact. You can't reduce the feelings that it engenders in people, the shared experiences, the collective memories, the things it will make people do, the other records it will create. You just simply cannot reduce it to the item that you're holding in your hand. In the same way that, a human body, you can't just you can't just point to a person, living or dead, and really use them as a means by which to explain the ways in which they live on in other people, the what happens, collectively between a bunch of people when they share ideas, when they share an experience. So I think that's what I meant. That's a kind of magic. There's a kind of that's a kind of mystical thing to me. That's a benign occult phenomenon, and I think that's what I meant. Really, you can't. It's just so much more than the sum of its parts. I don't think it will ever not be.
So during the pandemic, when
Yeah,
these listening parties were happening on X,
yeah,
one of the reasons I'm speaking to you and with you, Pete, is because of these listening parties. There was a Cocteau Twins one with Simon Raymond.
yeah.
And I was watching all these comments and I was watching how Tim was interacting with Simon. And I thought, oh my God, that's what I want to do. And I had
Mm.
been an elementary school teacher for 20 plus years.
Oh wow.
And so, long story short, those listening parties helped me move out of my educational career and into this new life as a podcaster and bringing people together in the art community. So for you, tell us a little bit more about what the listening parties during the pandemic meant to you.
I just thought they were just such a fantastic way to revisit a record, to remember what it was like to hear a record for the first time. In the same way that if one of your children hears a record you love for the first time, then you remember, you live that moment again, you live it through them. And what was magical to me was seeing artists who maybe were even dismissive of some aspects of their own work just really see their music through other people's eyes in a way that even playing them at a gig didn't quite seem to do. And I just thought that was such an amazing, like for Tim, even if Tim hadn't made all this music on his own and with the Charlatans, I just think if he'd only achieved that in his life, that would be an astounding service that he's sort of done for people. And and this wonderful thing where everyone can be a participant, it kind of erased the kind of divide between artists and fans, and sort of zoned in on the fact that we're sort of all fans. We're all we're all sort of drinking from the same river, really. We're all, you're just. I think it's sort of really important to understand, and it took me a while to understand it after I became a writer, that artists, even the artists that you don't like, they're not trying to trick you. The vast majority of them, at any rate, are not trying to trick you. They're not trying to sort of hoodwink you into, you know. They're not trying to sell you a dud. They're creating a thing. Yeah, they're creating something in a space where previously there was nothing.
Yeah,
and that's kind of a magical thing to do. And it's you're not. It's just because you're not. To be honest, I think even if you were doing it to make money, even if you were doing it because you wanted to be a millionaire, there are so many other ways to try and become rich. And this is one of the loveliest ways to try and do it. So if we think about Neil Diamond going into the Brill building as a young man, yeah, sure, he's there because he wants to make it, just as Carole King was, and, Lieber and Stoller, and, all these people. But he went in there and he wrote Solitary Man. And Solitary Man is, Rick, you mentioned Rick Rubin to me earlier on. Rick Rubin understands how what a great record that is, because it was one of the first songs they talked about when Rick produced him on his 12 songs album. I know I've interviewed Neil, so he told me that story. And so, later on in life, Neil went through therapy, and he kind of belatedly came to the realization that, in a way, without even realizing it, Solitary Man was his sort of calling, his kind of existential calling card, in a way. It was how he'd always felt as a kid up until that point. Maybe he still feels that way. He still feels a kind of distance between himself and the wider world, which he would rather not. He feels like somehow there's a kind of part of him that will always be lonely and apart. And he did that, he did that too. But he went into the Brill building. Let's say we don't know why he went into the Brill. Let's say he just wanted to write a hit record and be a millionaire. It still doesn't make Solitary Man any worse a record. This stuff, these amazing things that, they soundtrack our life, and they explain to us what we are, who we are. The records that you love. I really, really believe that especially as a kid, you really the records you fall in love with, you sort of fall in love with them because there are sort of proxy means by which they're sort of telling you who you are. They're sort of explaining your situation to you, and that's why you connect with them really intensely in a way maybe that you might not even as an adult. There are, in a way that I was saying earlier on, that those ABBA records, they kind of sort of explain something about what I was seeing around me. I've had loads of records that have done that over the years.
So keep that in mind, because I'm going to read some artists that he had on his guests for his listening parties and albums that they were celebrating. So Lush, Love Life, Aztec Camera, Highland, Hard Rain, The Breeders, Last Splash, Chemical Brothers, Dig Your Own Hole, Gomez, Bring It On. I mean, the list goes. And I was thinking to myself, this is all the shit I love. So,
yeah, I mean, Aztec Camera, that. Sorry?
Some of these albums that were being celebrated and honored in that communal fashion were some of the greatest albums in my musical experience. They shaped and molded and formed me. So tell us a few more albums, if you wouldn't mind, that had that effect on you.
What do you mean by beauty? Hope you know the consequences.
Well, you mentioned Highland Hard Rain. That was an absolute thunderbolt. That absolutely turned my world upside down. And I just like Roddy. The first time I set eyes on Roddy Frame, which was in the video to Walk Out to Winter, and he was wearing his suede brown fringed jacket, I just kind of thought, is it kind of crazy to sort of imagine that I could like maybe sort of have that vibe, maybe even look like him one day? And so I just thought, because I was lost, you know, I was like on the cusp of adolescence, really not, just completely adrift. Really, I didn't know how I was going to get to where I needed to get to. I didn't even know where I needed to get to. So how to get there was even more of an insoluble mystery to me. And I used to replay that video over and over again. I remember my older brother walking into the room and kind of saying, I just want to give you a piece of advice. If you ever for a minute think of getting yourself a jacket like that, then don't, because you'll be laughed out of the playground. You know, in school. And that as a result, you know, that kind of really put me in my place. But a few months later, I bought Highland Hard Rain, and I sat there cross-legged with the headphones on. I was alone in the house, and actually, it's funny, really. The connection was absolute, overwhelming, intense, really emotional, and but it wasn't until sometimes you can feel feelings for a record or for anything really that you don't have the vocabulary to articulate to yourself. And it was only when I was writing about it years later that I kind of really sort of made myself try and remember the truth of what it was that made me connect with the record so much. And in a way, it's a perfect record for someone uncertain about their future to really sort of get into, because in a way, he was uncertain about his future. There's a lot there, especially on side 2. There are songs about either being lost or losing your way, or really being in a place that you can't come back from, you know, down the dip, back on board. And am I gonna be a fucker? Am I gonna fuck up? You know, he was still very young himself. He was a teenager when he wrote those songs, and these are all sort of questions that I was, to a certain degree, I was asking myself. So I think that's partly why I love the record, and obviously the songs are amazing. I used to love how he used to go on about the band Love and about Bob Dylan and about Django Reinhardt in his interviews, because it made me. I said, well, I need to listen to Django Reinhardt. And, you know, it was educational. I mean, every time people mentioned, you know, a musician I'd never heard of, it was massively educational for me, you know. And that's how I learned about music. I was just like, all these names, they all just lodged in my head. So that was a big one. I mean, I've just got so many records. Like REM kind of just turned my world upside down. That they opened up to me was so different to mine. It was so, and they just had a sound that was. I just couldn't get enough of that sound. That what they did with guitars was what Peter Buck did with a guitar. It was just, so that kind of opened me up to things like the Byrds later on, you know, and folk rock. The other one actually I've got to mention is from this period was an album by 10,000 Maniacs, who I know you've had on, right?
Yeah.
The Wishing Chair by 10,000 Maniacs, which in their canon is not really a record that people go on about much, but just both musically and lyrically, it's essentially their kind of version of a British folk rock record. Although I didn't know that at the time, but you know, Joe Boyd produced it, and they were really vibing off Fairport Convention and people like that. But actually, Natalie Merchant's lyrics, the combination of John Lombardi when he was in the group, I think he pronounces it Lombardi, but written down it's Lombardo, so I don't know. But what he brought to the group, which he sort of had this way of playing guitar, which they never really survived after he left the group, and he co-composed a lot of the songs. And and Natalie Merchant's lyrics, which really it's one of the few albums that you could almost enjoy as much reading as listening to it. But her vignettes of small town life, wanting to escape. Again, there's this theme that obviously really spoke to me. Like, am I going to be stuck here forever? What's going to happen to me? All of this stuff I was clearly sort of identifying with. It's just a beautiful record. That's the one.
Okay, so but I want to finish this part of the conversation up with a quote again from Tim Burgess' book regarding the album that you just mentioned, Highland Hard Rain. And Tim writes this: in the early 1980s, indie was defined as much by its jangly guitars as an independent record label who released the records. Then Aztec Camera was the band who at once defined and then reinvented the genre with their debut album. And it was driven by the frontman, Robbie Crane. Dexterous guitar playing. People forget what an amazing guitarist. Yeah?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, he was their very first single, Highland Hard Rain, their very first single, Just Like Gold, which was released on the Postcard label, which Roddy's never assented to its reissue in any form. But it's a few years ago, I played that song to a young friend of mine who's in a band, and he just started laughing halfway through because he just he said it's almost as if they were trying to win a bet to see who could get the most chord changes into a single song. And that's Just Like Gold. I mean, that makes it sound quite clinical, but actually it's there's something about a young band that's just formed, not always, but most of the time. And it's a really hard thing to get back. But what I love about young bands is they play like it's an emergency. And
yes.
And it's just the best thing, like when you've got that urgency, and they just play like, something is, someone's going to pull the plug in 10 minutes or something, or that like someone's appendix is going to burst or something. That's the way young bands sound. I love that.
So I saw a great interview that you did several years ago regarding life as young musician, and the barriers that pose themselves for young musicians. What do you think are the barriers now for young musicians?
That it's almost impossible to make a living out of it. I mean, that's obviously the first barrier, and there are less venues because venues are going out of business. My youngest daughter is a singer-songwriter, and I'm just seeing what she's had to go through and she's got a record deal now, but you can't, there's not enough money to sort of, if you play in a band, it's not enough money to sort of kind of keep a band going. And, streaming, I mean, it's kind of made it impossible to make a living because, 15 years ago, you could sell like 3,000 copies of an album, and if you were careful with your money, that would be just about enough to turn it into a living. Those numbers are just not happening anymore. I run a small label. We typically press 1,000. We're reissues, and actually it's easier to sell reissues, but it's hard to even sell 1,000 copies of some titles. 15 years ago, it would have been a different story. There's just not, the money's just not reaching artists. Yeah, it's awful. And there's no bands anymore. You understand why there's no bands anymore, because it's hard for bands to sort of stay together. When I was a kid, I'd turn on the main UK music show, which was Top of the Pops. Yeah, you could have like in the same episode, you could have like Madness, Dexys Midnight Runners, all these kind of UB40, the Specials. These bands had like 7 or 8 members in them, and the reason they'd managed to stay together was because we had a system where if some of them had been unemployed, then you got just about enough social security money to sort of mean that you could kind of put the hours into being in a band, so you could stay together long enough for your band to be good enough to make records, which would then put money into the British economy. And which is why we got to a point where the music industry was our third biggest export. And I don't see how that can happen anymore on the basis of what we have now. People in this country, often people, talk about sort of, benefits grandeurs or whatever. People who kind of like who try and avoid getting a job to live. There are actually very, very few people who will somehow kind of make it their life's mission to avoid having to work in order to get money off the state. The more common sort of situation was that, if you were trying to get a job, and if you weren't, you were sort of essentially doing something with that time that would make you able to contribute to the economy further down the line.
But and I hear what you're saying, and I want to play devil's advocate there. If there isn't that pot of gold that there once was for rising musicians, on the flip side, with that pot of gold that was sitting there, maybe they had less autonomy because someone was kind of pulling more of the strings. And nowadays, the pot of gold may not be so evident, but bands tend to have more control of their music. Yeah?
Yes, although I don't think it's an either-or situation. I mean, you could have you could have had a situation, like the one you had, maverick artists, like, let's just say, for instance, PJ Harvey, who was signed to Island by the end of 1992. She was signed to Island Records, who are owned by Polygram, who are now owned by Universal. And, you had, with a kind of sensible A&R policy in hand, which was essentially inherited, following a model of the early 70s. So you had people like David Geffen, who, when he created Asylum Records, you could have a kind of cultural microclimate where, you had Joni Mitchell, who was a successful artist, and I don't know, was Jackson Browne on Asylum? I think he might have been, but also you could have, Judy Sill, who wasn't successful in her lifetime, but was allowed to make the records she wanted to, or Gene Clark, who made no other, which was an absolute commercial disaster. But those records sell now. I mean, it really is a long game. Music is a long game, and also it makes sort of good business sense. I remember one thing, that when EMI in this country was taken over by hedge fund managers, the first thing they did was get rid of all the unprofitable artists. So you had this situation where, like, you take over a label like Parlophone, which has got, I think, on whose roster at the time included John Cale and Dr. John. And of course, okay, they're not going to make any money. Of course, they're not going to make any money for your label. But if you want to sign the next Radiohead, they might look at your roster and look at what you've got, and they might say, "Oh, John Cale is on the well. If they'll sign John Cale, then we'll probably be okay." And actually, weirdly enough, that's what happened with PJ Harvey as well. PJ Harvey ultimately was torn between Ireland and some other label, I can't remember which. And she saw what Julian Cope was doing at the time. Julian Cope was recording Jehovah Kill at the time, which was no one's idea of a successful commercial album. But it was what he was doing on Jehovah Kill that made her sign to Ireland. And she's still signed to that label to this day.
And then let's transition before we wrap it up here. What are your concerns? If there are any positives that you feel regarding AI in the music industry?
The only positive thing that I've got from AI in terms of music is that sometimes I love a record so much that I just want to separate the stems and kind of isolate individual parts and listen to them in order to sort of somehow kind of really enjoy. Like sometimes you want to hear an instrumental of a record, and there's AI software which will allow you to do that. So, like I was so obsessed with the rhythm section on ABBA records that a few months ago I just isolated the rhythm section, like the drum track on some ABBA records, because I'm just the kind of sado who will actually just sit at home and listen to the drumming, the isolated drumming. And there's an AI software package that allows you to do that. I've not really found any sort of. I'm sure there are. I mean, I understand that in kind of in medicine and the pursuit to find cures for illnesses and so forth. I understand that AI has a part to play in that. I don't. Beyond that, I don't know what it can give to music at this point.
I'm sure you've spoken to musicians, artists that are absolutely terrified. Yeah.
In terms of would you mean like sort of recreating sort of simulations of music by those artists and so forth?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, hear about things like that. I'm kind of like it makes me kind of glad in a way that I'm almost 56 years old, and in 25 years time I probably won't be a part of the world that we kind of seem to be heading towards, because it just sounds horrible. But it's hideous. We should do what we can to sort of obviously we should do what we can to protect artists, because without the art that we grow up with, what are we? We're nothing.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Okay. I want to read something to you. This is written by Rick Rubin, the
Yeah.
legendary music producer, on the book, The Creative Active Way of Being. And this is what he says about play, PLAY. Making art is a serious matter. Harnessing creative energy from source, shepherding ideas into the physical plane, participating in the cosmic cycle of creation. The opposite is also true. Making art is pure play. Within every artist, there's a child emptying a box of crayons onto the floor, searching for just the right color to draw the sky. It might be violet, olive, or burnt orange. I used to play often with my students because I felt that was the best way for them to absorb the material.
Mm.
So for you and the work that you do, how does play manifest itself?
I guess there's a certain amount of play. The blank page is kind of your enemy in a way. So you have to sort of do whatever you can to put something on the page, because starting is terrifying. Starting is always terrifying. That's the one thing that's been true the whole time. And in order to even writing a feature, which, I don't think anyone's really, even the best feature you've ever read, you're going to find it hard to compare to a really good song. But that's just kind of what I do for a living. So, but I think throwing yourself open to, the play as it's referred to in this context is really just throwing yourself open to serendipity. And that's really hugely important, whether or not you're a songwriter or in any creative act. And, and it's what's really paralyzing is the idea that there might be one perfect way of it could be a feature, it could be a painting, it could be a song, whatever. There's a perfect way out there of doing it, and you have to find it. And that's terrifying, and you're not going to find that perfect way. But what you can do is just keep experiencing. What matters really is what you did in the end. And as long your reasons for doing it. So, for instance, I wrote this book which came out 5 years ago, which is a sort of musical memoir. It was a sort of childhood memoir. It's a sort of a love letter to pop music, and about how music can sometimes help you find your identity, especially if you come from the background that I came from. I didn't really know how I was going to end. I was about halfway through. I didn't know exactly how I was going to end it. I knew some aspects of how I was going to end it, but I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to do it. And I was watching a documentary about cinema one night, and it was a song about it was a documentary about coming of age movies, and in that moment I realized that what I was writing was a coming of age book. And once I realized that, then I knew exactly where it needed to end. Another time I was in 2003, I was commissioned to do a cover story for Mojo magazine about Radiohead, who were just about to release "Hail to the Thief," and I'd followed them around. I'd done a few interviews with them to kind of build up a kind of picture of, the story that needed to be told. But it was agreed that I wouldn't finish writing the feature until I'd seen them at Glastonbury, like playing at Glastonbury that year. They were headlining Glastonbury, and the final 1,000 words would be written after I'd seen their set at Glastonbury. And I had somehow had to think of 1,000 words that would wrap it all up, sort of somehow wrap up what the rest of the feature had been leaning towards. And I was terrified because I didn't really know if that was going to happen, if I was going to get more quotes from them, if what happened in the set was really going to expedite that outcome. And it just so happened that a book that I brought with me was an anthology of writing by a music writer called Ian MacDonald called The People's Music. And there was an amazing essay about Pink Floyd in there, about what Pink Floyd mean, why they're a quintessentially British band, what they tell us about being British. And all the questions that he was asking about Pink Floyd, I realized were sort of questions that I'd slightly been asking about Radiohead. And somehow that sort of, in a way, that presented me with a way of ending it kind of told me that was kind of the piece I've been trying to write all along. So it doesn't really, what would have happened if I hadn't seen that documentary about cinema? What would have happened if I hadn't read that Ian MacDonald essay? What would those features would have been finished somehow? That work would have been completed.
Yeah.
But they would have been completed in a different way. And I guess maybe better or maybe worse, but what matters is what you did, not all the things you could have done.
But this is interesting because in your line of work, when you're interviewing or writing, there are possibly limitations on, number of words, this and that, deadlines. But listen to this. Rick says this: in play, there are no stakes, no boundaries, no right or wrong, no quotas for productivity. It's an uninhibited state where your spirit can run free. Feel free to experiment, make messes, embrace randomness. And when playtime is over, our adult aspect might come in to analyze, what did the kids make today? But see, I guess what I'm getting at is, in your line of work, can you get really messy? Can you really experiment?
Well, you have to. I'm a journalist, so you have to fulfill the brief,
right?
But you can. But then if you're a songwriter, there's a brief you have to fulfill there. Unless you do your Lou Reed and you submit metal machine music, which is fine, obviously, but. Lou Reed could do that because he had a bit of bargaining power, and it was metal machine music. There's something very important about metal machine music, actually, which is it's a really important thing for all artists to remember. I really believe this about, even though I'm not a musician, so who am I to say? But it strikes me that you can really fixate on the piece of work, when actually the real piece of work is what you achieve over a whole sort of lifetime. That's ultimately what the real story you're telling. And so metal machine music was important in that way, because in the kind of abstract sculpture of Lou Reed that is his life's work, then that's an important detail in that sculpture. And so I don't think with the artists that I'm friends with, I always say to them, honestly, you just do. It's like nothing. Not everything doesn't kind of hinge on this next piece of work, and I think that's an important thing for artists to hear. It's a few years ago when Twitter wasn't like a boiling cesspit of all the worst things about humanity. I used to participate in it, and I was trying to, when there were more good wolves on Twitter, then occasionally I used to pop up. I used to sort of, like, if I'd had a thought that I thought was worth sharing, I might sort of share it. And I remember I was listening to an album that the Hollies made in 1983. I think it was whatever album they made that came out in 1983. It's a patchy record. There's some things that are good on it, and there's some things that I'm not so great or haven't dated particularly well. And I sort of I wrote a tweet which was something along the lines of, I'm listening to Holly's album they made in 1983. Not one of the best records, but I but it is a Holly's record, and I'm always interested in what any record that the Hollies have made, because it's the Hollies. And and then, weirdly enough, out of nowhere, I got a reply from Neil Finn. Neil Finn of
Sure.
You Should Live Split Ends and of Crowded House. And and I've interviewed Neil a few times. I know him a little bit. And Neil said something really flattery, like something that made my day. It was something like, you really are a kind soul, or something like that. Now, did Neil Finn saying that I am a kind soul mean that I am a kind soul? Or more likely, did it mean that my tweet about the Hollies spoke to an insecurity that artists have, that the next piece of work they might be working on might be a misjudgment, and will the world stand in judgment of them decades down the line because their album X wasn't as good in their view as album Y? And see, what underlay all of this is the fact that just my belief, my trenchant belief, I think this is true, that we're all working on a sculpture, that we're all working on a self-portrait, and that's, in a way, that's what life is. I'm sorry, this sounds very serious and ponderous, but anyway, we're all making a sculpture that will only be finished when we die, and everything we do is like a chisel strike into the sculpture. And so don't worry too much about the thing you're doing right now. It might be the best thing you've ever done, but it might not be. But that's not the piece of that. Ultimately, that's not the piece of art.
But the art that you sculpt, that you chisel away at, and I know that you wear different hats. And as a journalist, well, let me give you an example. So the interview that you did with Robert Forster,
Yeah,
great interview.
I wish I could remember it now, but
You can go back on YouTube and check it out.
oh yeah, I know. Yeah, okay, yeah, I know it.
Here's why I love that interview. I have no idea what was said before you guys hit record, but it seemed very natural. It seemed like in a space where it wasn't so tidied up. It didn't look so manicured in a way that seemed superficial.
Mm,
It just looked like two friends talking. So again, going back to
mm.
journalism, how much freedom, how much are you granted to be experimental? Because I imagine an interview with that like that. I mean, it's Robert Forster, for Christ's sake. So you know what I'm saying?
Well, depends who I'm writing for. So when I was writing for the Times,
Yeah.
obviously there are certain things that I couldn't really assume that, if I'm interviewing like Midlake for the Times, then most of their readers, the London Times, I guess to you guys, most of their readers aren't going to know what Midlake is. So I'm going to have to really put them into context for people. There's some actual kind of practical housekeeping that needs to be done here before I go on to tell the story that I'm going to try and tell of my encounter with Midlake, which along the way will hopefully tell you whether or not their music is the kind of music that you might want to spend time with. You might want to have it in your life. So there's some practical considerations to sort of hit, but also I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to sort of, tell it, make it a vignette, like a snapshot of that encounter. So I guess it's a kind of collision of like information that needs to be imparted with just a sort of sense using, your experience and, techniques you've picked up along the way to try and kind of put you in mind. And I guess another skill that you're using is, the skill, hopefully the skill of knowing what questions to ask at the right time, and to have a conversation that feels natural to both yourself and the person that you're interviewing. With Robert Forster, what was very helpful was that we'd met several times before, and so Robert felt, Robert, we're both sort of comfortable around each other. Robert was the first person I ever interviewed, well, jointly, along with Lindy Morrison of the Go-Betweens, where back when I was 16 and I just decided that I would try and do a fanzine. And so I met Robert as a teenager. And so he's the longest gap between first and most recent interview with me and an artist is with Robert. So the last time I interviewed him was, I think, a couple of years ago, and so what, between so I was 16 then, I was 53 a couple of years ago. So what is that? So more than 40 years, right? Or nearly 40 years, 37 years, maybe. Yeah.
What would you tell aspiring journalists? What pearls of wisdom would you offer up in today's climate, in today's music culture?
Well, it depends if they want to make a living out. If they want to make a living out of it, I don't really know that I have anything useful to say to them. In fact, I think I probably need their advice more than they need mine, because they're probably more au fait with the sort of technologies that you need to know in order to sort of set up to be a kind of journalist today. To be, you'd probably have to be doing it, in another medium, on YouTube or something. So I'm not. I'm not sure I do have much to tell them. I mean, I could offer tips about interviewing, things that you should or shouldn't do in an interview, like maybe listen to what the person is saying, so that if there's a kind of, don't keep looking at your questions, because you might be missing a kind of useful follow-on question. Try and do as much research as you can. You might only use up 20% of your research in the interview, but you don't know which 20% you're going to need. So that's just how it works, really. Certainly how it works for me anyway. And I don't really know that. I get the reason I do what I do is really just a sort of a function of the enthusiasm I have, my obsession with music, really. And but what's nice is lately I've been interviewing non-musicians, because I've been doing a lot of work for a publication in the UK called the Radio Times, which, so they, for whatever reason, they seem to think I'm a suitable person to go off and interview television personalities and actors, and which is great, because the hardest thing about music journalism is describing music. It's really hard. It never gets any easier. So I like to be in a situation where I don't have to describe music is almost like a treat for me now.
So what are you enjoying about this gig, if you will?
Just the fact that you get to sort of people watch, to read. I mean, all the things that I like enjoying about interviewing musicians, but I just like, coming away and thinking about people's sort of body language, or things that were maybe implied but not explicitly said, or just things that, just trying to honor the truth of a situation that might not necessarily have been expressed in words. Maybe just something that feels like, again, I guess you're just trying to tell a story. I'm God, if anyone wants to pay me to write, then I'm just the luckiest man in the world. So I don't have any other skills. I literally don't have any other monetizable skills. So this is it for me. I don't, honestly. I mean, look, what have I got?
Come on, man. Okay, I want to wrap it up with this last one, and this is a doozy, because I think it's going to be hard for you to answer. I might be wrong. Here we go. We're going to do a full circle here. This is Rules for a Night again. And this is on a chapter called Pride. Here we go, Pete. Never pretend you are a knight or attempt to diminish yourself because you deem it will make others more comfortable. We show others the most respect by offering the best of ourselves. Arrogance is born of insecurity. Pride is different. It is born of dignity, self-worth, and self-respect. We all see the world through the prism of our identity. If our self-worth is low, it affects everything we do. The point of life is to contribute to others, but without a certain self-regard, it is sometimes difficult to make breakfast. Okay, So he goes on, talks about a knight taking pride in his handwriting, how he cleans his tools and all that stuff.
Mm.
Pete, what are you proud of in the work that you've done and how it's contributed to the betterment of people's lives?
I'm proud. Proud of my children, and I'm proud of the fact that my wife still wants to be married to me. I think that's kind of I'm really proud of the fact that like my children aren't appalled by the idea of spending time with me. Does it have to be work though? Is the question related to work?
Whatever you're proud of.
No, that's what I'm proud of. I'm proud of the fact that I'm proud of my family. Yeah. And the fact that they're sort of happy to hang out with me.
Well, I'm sure they are, and I'm sure many friends feel that way. And the people that you have come across in your life, people that you've interviewed, I mean, you really have carved out and, as you said, chiseled a life for yourself that I feel honors all these different facets to what you love and what you're passionate about. And I'm so honored that we had this conversation.
Thank you so much. I've seen who you've interviewed, and I'm in incredible company. So,
well, thank you. And I've learned a great deal just in the last hour and 20 minutes. And I will end it with this. And I want to tell everyone listening to this podcast, great conversation is always out there. You just have to keep your ears open. My name is W, host of Surprise Cast. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.